Maid's daughter spent her last $5 helping an old veteran on a cold winter night. By morning, 100 Navy SEALs were lined outside her door. The wind off the bay cut like knives on the winter night. On a cracked sidewalk in Port Madison, a 10-year-old girl named Grace stood shivering, clutching her last $5 bill. "Mama said we have to look after ourselves first," she whispered, staring at the hungry old man on the bench. But something inside her refused to walk away. That single act of kindness, one bowl of stew, one fragile choice between hunger and hope, set off a chain of events no one could have imagined. By dawn, black vans filled the street. Neighbors watched in disbelief as men in dark uniforms lined up outside her door. 100 Navy SEALs standing at attention, waiting for orders from a child. What started as a little girl's $5 meal ended as a full military operation. This is the story of how one forgotten $5 bill called an army home. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A little girl's last $5 would soon command an army. The wind off the bay had teeth, and it was biting at 10-year-old Grace's cheeks. Stood on the cracked sidewalk, she clutched a single, worn $5 bill in her red mitten, the paper soft and fragile as a dried leaf. Was a single warm meal for a stranger worth the storm she knew would be waiting for her at home? The evening sky over the small coastal town of Port Madison was the color of a deep bruise, purples and dark grays bleeding into one another above the naval shipyard that dominated the horizon. For most people, the distant groan of a ship's horn was just background noise. For Grace, it was a constant reminder of a life she'd never known, of the father she'd never met, and of the immense, lonely world that seemed to press in on the small apartment she shared with her mother. Their apartment was on the third floor of a tired-looking building that smelled of damp wood and boiled cabbage. It was a place of worn-out things. A sofa with a faded flower pattern, a rug worn thin in the path from the door to the kitchen, and a constant, gnawing worry that was as much a piece of the furniture as the wobbly kitchen table. Grace's mother, Helen, was a maid. She cleaned the large, beautiful houses on the other side of town, the ones with wide green lawns that ran down to the water's edge. She left before Grace woke up for school and often returned long after the sun had set, her hands raw and her face etched with a weariness that seemed to have settled deep into her bones. This $5 bill was a treasure. It had been a surprise, a tip from one of Helen's clients, a woman who'd remarked on Grace's polite manners when she'd visited her mother at work one day. "Buy yourself a little something, dear," the woman had said, pressing the bill into Grace's hand. Helen had been hesitant, wanting to put it toward the electric bill, but Grace had begged. "Just for a little while, Mama. Please." She had plans for that money. There was a book in the window of the secondhand shop, a story about a girl who discovers a hidden garden. Grace had visited it every day on her way home from school, tracing the girl's face on the dusty glass. That book was a promise of another world, a place where things weren't so gray and tired. $5 was the exact price. It felt like destiny. But for the past week, her route home had included a new, heart-wrenching stop. On a cold metal bench facing the choppy waters of the bay, an old man sat. He was there every day, from the time she walked to school in the morning until she walked home in the fading light. He was always in the same spot, wearing a thin, dark coat that was no match for the relentless wind. He was clean, his white hair neatly combed, his back held ramrod straight as if by some invisible force of will. But he was painfully thin, and his face had the pale, hollowed-out look of someone who hadn't eaten a proper meal in a very long time. He never asked for anything. He never made eye contact with the people who hurried past. He just sat, staring at the gray naval ships in the distance, his hands resting on his knees. There was a profound stillness about him, a dignity that seemed almost defiant in the face of his obvious hardship. Grace had started watching him, her heart aching with a feeling she was too young to name. It was a mixture of pity, respect, and a strange sort of recognition. He looked like the faded photograph on their mantelpiece, the one of her great-grandfather in his stiff military uniform. General James Peterson, a man her mother spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. A hero from a long-ago war. That man in the photo had the same straight back, the same unwavering gaze. Today, the cold was worse than ever. A damp chill seeped through Grace's coat, and she could see the old man shivering, a slight, uncontrollable tremor that he tried to hide by clenching his jaw. She saw him press a hand to his stomach, a small, involuntary movement of pain. And in that moment, the book about the secret garden vanished from her mind. All she could see was his hunger. All she could feel was his cold. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. Grace, we don't have a penny to spare. We have to be careful. We have to look after ourselves first. It was the mantra of their life, a lesson born of necessity and hard experience. Helen wasn't a cold woman, but life had taught her to be a practical one. Her kindness was reserved for Grace, a fierce, protective love that left little room for the needs of strangers. Wasting $5, a fortune that could buy 2 boxes of pasta and a jar of sauce to last them 3 nights, was unthinkable. Grace stood on the corner, her body frozen with indecision. The wind whipped a strand of her blonde hair across her face. She looked from the old man on the bench to the warm, steamy window of The Anchor, a small diner that catered to shipyard workers and fishermen. The smell of frying bacon and hot coffee drifted out, a warm, inviting cloud in the cold air. It smelled like safety. It smelled like everything the old man didn't have. Her hand tightened on the $5 bill inside her mitten. Her secret garden, or his secret hunger? The choice felt immense, a decision that a 10-year-old should never have to make. She thought of her mother's tired face, of the unpaid bills tucked behind the sugar bowl on their kitchen counter. Then she looked back at the man, who had closed his eyes against the wind, his face a mask of quiet suffering. He looked just like her great-grandfather, a soldier left behind on a lonely battlefield. Taking a deep breath that shuddered in her small chest, Grace made her choice. She turned away from the bookstore and walked toward the diner, the bell above the door chiming softly as she pushed her way inside. The diner was warm and bright, a welcome shock after the biting cold. A handful of men in work clothes sat at the counter, their laughter and conversation a low, comforting rumble. A waitress with a kind, weary face and a pencil tucked behind her ear looked down at Grace. "Just you, sweetie?" Grace nodded, her voice small. "I'd like to get some food to go, please." She stood on her toes to see the menu board hanging on the wall. The prices made her stomach clench. Everything seemed impossibly expensive. She was terrified the $5 wouldn't be enough. "What can I get for you?" the waitress asked, wiping down the counter with a damp cloth. "What's the warmest thing you have?" Grace asked, her eyes scanning the board desperately. The waitress paused, her expression softening as she took in the serious little girl with the flushed cheeks and the worried eyes. "Well, the beef stew is pretty popular on a day like today. Comes with a thick slice of bread for dipping. It'll warm you right up." She pointed to the price. $4.50. Relief washed over Grace so intensely her knees felt weak. "I'll take that, please." She slid the $5 bill onto the counter. It looked small and insignificant in the bright diner light. The waitress took the money and rang it up, handing Grace 2 quarters back in change. As she waited, Grace tucked the coins deep into her pocket. 50 cents. That's what was left of her treasure. The waitress soon returned with a sturdy container of stew, the heat radiating through the cardboard, and a thick slice of buttered bread wrapped in wax paper, all tucked into a small paper bag. "Here you go, hon. You be careful out there, it's getting nasty." "Thank you," Grace whispered, taking the bag. The warmth seeped into her cold hands, and the smell of the rich, savory stew made her own stomach rumble with hunger. For a second, she was tempted to keep it for herself, to take it home as a surprise for her and her mother. It would be the best dinner they'd had in months. But the image of the old man, shivering on the bench, pushed the thought away. This warmth wasn't for her. She stepped back out into the cold, the wind immediately snatching at the paper bag. Grace clutched it to her chest and walked the short distance to the bench. The old man hadn't moved. His eyes were still closed. For a scary moment, she wondered if he was okay. She stood before him, her heart thumping against her ribs. What was she supposed to say? Her mother had always told her not to talk to strangers. But this felt different. This felt important. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. The man's eyes snapped open. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and for a moment they were sharp and alert, the eyes of a man who was used to assessing threats. Then they softened as they focused on the small girl standing in front of him. I thought you might be hungry," Grace stammered, holding out the bag. "It's beef stew. It's warm." The man stared at the bag, then back at her. He didn't move. His face was a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and something else Grace couldn't understand. Pride, maybe. A deep, wounded pride. "I don't take charity," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. Grace's face fell. Her eyes started to sting with tears of disappointment and fear. She had spent all her money. She was going to face her mother's worry. And for what? To be rejected? "It's not charity," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It's a gift. Because it's cold. And my great-grandpa was a soldier. He always said you should look after your own." She didn't know where the words came from, but they felt true. The man's expression changed. The hardness in his eyes flickered. He looked at her more closely now, studying her small, earnest face. He glanced down at the bag she was holding out, its warmth a silent invitation. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling off the water. A battle was being fought behind those pale blue eyes, and Grace waited, her arms starting to ache from the weight of the bag. Finally, slowly, he reached out a hand. His fingers were long and thin, the knuckles swollen, but his hand was steady. He took the bag from her, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. "What's your name, child?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Grace," she said. He nodded, looking down at the bag in his lap as if it contained something precious. "Thank you, Grace," he said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. "You are aptly named." He didn't say anything else. He just sat there, holding the bag. Grace lingered for a moment, unsure what to do next. Then, she gave a small nod and turned to walk home, her mitten feeling strangely empty. As she reached the corner, she risked a look back. The old man had opened the container, and a cloud of steam rose into the cold air. He was eating, slowly and deliberately, his head bowed over the warm meal. A small, quiet warmth spread through Grace's chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the diner and everything to do with the man on the bench. It was a better feeling than any book could have given her. She pulled her thin coat tighter and hurried toward home, the 2 quarters jingling in her pocket, a tiny, metallic sound against the growing roar of the wind. She knew her mother would be worried. She knew dinner would be plain. But for the first time in a long time, Grace felt like she had done something truly important. She had no idea just how important it was. The walk to her apartment building felt longer than usual. The sun had disappeared completely, and the streetlights cast long, wavering shadows on the pavement. Each step brought her closer to the inevitable conversation with her mother, and the warm feeling in her chest began to cool, replaced by a familiar knot of anxiety. She rehearsed what she would say, trying to find the right words to explain the look in the old man's eyes, the way his hands trembled from the cold. But how could you explain a feeling? She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, her footsteps echoing in the quiet, dimly lit stairwell. She could already smell the faint scent of laundry detergent and bleach that clung to her mother's work clothes. She paused outside their apartment door, number 3B, the paint peeling around the edges. Taking one last, deep breath, she used her key to let herself in. The apartment was quiet. A single lamp was on in the living room, casting a soft, yellow glow on the worn furniture. Helen was sitting at the small kitchen table, a stack of envelopes and a calculator in front of her. She wasn't looking at them, though. She was staring at a piece of paper in her hands, her expression one of utter defeat. She looked up as Grace came in, and for a moment, her tired face brightened. "There you are, honey. I was starting to get worried," she said, her voice strained. "Sorry, Mama," Grace said, shrugging off her coat and hanging it on the hook by the door. "I was just walking." Helen's eyes, sharp and perceptive, noticed Grace's empty hands. "Did you go to the bookstore? Did you get your book?" she asked, a hopeful note in her voice. She wanted Grace to have that small joy. Grace's stomach twisted. She shook her head, unable to meet her mother's gaze. "No." Helen frowned, a small line appearing between her eyebrows. "What's wrong? Did you lose the money?" The worry in her voice was immediate. $5 was not something they could afford to lose. "No, I didn't lose it," Grace said quietly, walking over to the table. She looked at the paper her mother was holding. It was an eviction notice. The words "Final Warning" were stamped across the top in angry red ink. The knot in Grace's stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. "Mama," she whispered. Helen quickly folded the paper and pushed it aside, trying to force a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's nothing, sweetie. Just a mistake. I'll sort it out tomorrow. But they both knew it wasn't a mistake. So, tell me what happened with the money. If you didn't buy the book, you should have brought it home. We need it for groceries, Grace. We talked about this. The moment had come. Grace took a shaky breath. I spent it, she said. Helen's fragile composure cracked. The disappointment in her eyes was worse than any anger. You spent it? On what? Candy? A toy? No, Grace said, her voice small but firm. I bought dinner. For the old man who sits on the bench by the bay. Helen stared at her, her mouth slightly open. She looked from Grace's earnest, fearful face to the eviction notice on the table. The sheer absurdity of the situation seemed to overwhelm her. The stranger on the bench. Grace, are you telling me you spent our last $5 on a stranger? He was hungry, Mama, Grace pleaded, her own eyes welling with tears. He was so cold. He looked like he was hurting. I couldn't just walk by. He reminded me of the picture of great-grandpa James. Helen sank back in her chair, pressing the heels of her hands to her eyes. A sound that was half sob, half laugh escaped her lips. Oh, Grace, your great-grandfather. He was a general. He commanded armies. He wasn't a homeless man on a park bench. He was a provider. He would never have let his family get into a situation like this. She gestured helplessly around the small, shabby room, at the pile of bills, at the stark reality of their poverty. You have a good heart, a beautiful, good heart, Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. But a good heart doesn't pay the rent. It doesn't put food on the table. That money, that was for milk and bread for the rest of the week. Now, I don't know what we're going to do. The tears Grace had been holding back finally spilled over, running down her cold cheeks. She had tried to do something good, something she thought her heroic great-grandfather would have approved of, but she had only made things worse. She had taken from her own mother to give to a stranger. The weight of her choice settled upon her, heavy and suffocating. I'm sorry, Mama, she cried, rushing to her mother's side and burying her face in her lap. I'm so sorry. Helen wrapped her arms around her daughter, stroking her blonde hair. Her own tears began to fall, silent drops that landed on Grace's head. She wasn't angry. She was terrified. She had worked so hard to shield Grace from the sharpest edges of their struggle, to maintain a sliver of hope and normalcy. And now, with an eviction notice on the table and an empty pantry, she felt as though she had failed completely. Shoo, it's okay, baby, she murmured, though it wasn't okay at all. It's okay. We'll figure something out. We always do. But that night, as Grace lay in her small bed, sleep refused to come. She listened to the sound of the wind rattling her window pane, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in her stomach. Through the thin wall, she could hear her mother in the kitchen, opening and closing cupboards, the quiet, desperate sounds of a parent trying to make a meal out of almost nothing. Later, long after the apartment fell silent, Grace heard another sound, one that broke her heart. It was the soft, muffled sound of her mother crying, trying to stifle her sobs so her daughter wouldn't hear. Grace curled into a tight ball beneath her thin blanket, clutching the 2 quarters in her fist. 50 cents. It felt like the price of her mother's tears. She squeezed her eyes shut, and the image of the old man eating the stew flashed in her mind. She saw his straight back, his pale blue eyes, and the flicker of gratitude she had seen there. Was it worth it? Had she made the right choice? She didn't know. All she knew was that in the cold, dark apartment, the consequences of her kindness felt like a terrible, crushing weight. She prayed for morning to come, hoping, with the blind faith of a child, that the daylight might somehow make things better. The morning arrived not with a gentle dawn, but with a flat, gray light that seemed to suck the color out of the world. It filtered through the thin curtains of Grace's window, offering no warmth, no promise of a better day. The wind had died down, leaving behind a profound and heavy silence. Grace had barely slept, and when she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with falling coins and the sound of her mother's weeping. She got out of bed and crept into the living room. Helen was already awake, dressed in her plain blue work uniform. She was at the stove, stirring a small pot of oatmeal, her back to Grace. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the heavy weight of the eviction notice and the ghost of the $5 bill. "Morning, Mama," Grace said, her voice a small, hesitant thing. Helen turned, and the smile she offered was a brave but brittle attempt. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and there were new, faint lines of worry etched around her mouth. "Good morning, sweetie. Sleep okay?" Grace just nodded, knowing it was a lie they both had to pretend to believe. She sat at the table, and her mother placed a small bowl of oatmeal in front of her. It was watery, made with twice the usual amount of water to make it stretch. There was no milk, no sugar. Grace ate it without a word, each spoonful a reminder of what she had given away. "I'll walk you to school this morning," Helen said, sipping a cup of hot water. They couldn't afford coffee or tea this week. "I have to go to the rental office before work to talk to them." Grace knew what that meant. Her mother was going to beg. She was going to plead for more time, to promise money she didn't have. A fresh wave of shame washed over Grace. This was her fault. The walk to school was a silent, hurried affair. Helen held Grace's hand, her grip tighter than usual, as if she were afraid of letting go. Grace kept her head down, watching the cracks in the sidewalk, unable to look at the people they passed. She didn't dare to look toward the bench by the bay. She couldn't bear to see if the old man was there, or worse, if the bench was empty. When they reached the schoolyard, Helen knelt, pulling Grace into a fierce hug. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and urgent. "No matter what happens, you are a good girl, Grace. You have a kind heart. Don't ever let this world make you hard. Do you understand?" Grace nodded, burying her face in her mother's shoulder, the familiar scent of bleach and lavender soap a small comfort. "I'm sorry, Mama." "I know," Helen whispered, kissing her forehead. "Now go on. Be good. I'll see you after school." Grace watched her mother walk away, a small, determined figure heading toward a battle she was destined to lose. The school bell rang, a shrill, jarring sound, and Grace turned and disappeared into the noisy, chaotic stream of children. The school day passed in a blur. Grace couldn't focus on her lessons. The words on the pages of her books swam before her eyes. The teacher's voice was a distant drone. All she could think about was her mother's face, the eviction notice, and the watery oatmeal. During recess, she sat alone on a bench in the corner of the playground, tracing patterns in the gravel with the toe of her worn sneaker. She felt a profound sense of isolation, as if she were separated from the other laughing, shouting children by an invisible wall of worry. When the final bell rang, Grace felt a surge of dread. She didn't want to go home. She didn't want to face the quiet, sad apartment. But she had nowhere else to go. She gathered her books, pulled on her coat, and started the slow walk home, her feet dragging with every step. The air outside was still and cold. The sky was the same uniform gray as the morning. As she neared the center of town, she noticed something was different. A low, powerful hum vibrated in the air. Parked along the main street that led to the naval shipyard were several large, dark green vehicles. They weren't cars or trucks, she recognized. They were imposing and official-looking, with no markings except for small, stenciled numbers. Men in crisp, dark uniforms stood near the vehicles, speaking quietly into radios. They weren't the local police. Their posture was different, more rigid, and their eyes were constantly scanning the area, missing nothing. The townspeople noticed, too. Small groups of people stood on the sidewalks, whispering and pointing. A sense of unease, of quiet alarm, had settled over Port Madison. The town was used to the presence of the Navy, but this was different. This felt like an occupation. Grace's heart began to beat a little faster. She clutched her backpack straps and tried to make herself as small as possible, hurrying past the stern-faced men. Her route took her past the bay, and despite her earlier resolve, her eyes were drawn to the bench. It was empty. A pang of disappointment, quickly followed by a strange sense of relief, went through her. Wherever the old man was, he wasn't sitting out in the cold today. As she turned onto her own street, her blood ran cold. One of the imposing green vehicles was parked directly in front of her apartment building. Two more uniformed men stood by the entrance, their arms crossed, their faces grim and unapproachable. Her first thought was of the eviction. Had they sent soldiers to throw them out? It didn't make sense, but in her panicked, 10-year-old mind, anything seemed possible. She wanted to run, to hide, but her legs felt like lead. She had to get home. Her mother was in there. She forced herself to walk forward, her eyes fixed on the ground. As she approached the entrance, one of the men stepped forward, blocking her path. He was a mountain of a man, with a square jaw and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the light. But when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Can I help you, miss?" I I live here," Grace stammered, pointing up at the building. The man's expression didn't change, but he seemed to look at her more closely. "What's your name?" "Grace Peterson." The man's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He exchanged a look with his partner, a quick, silent communication that Grace couldn't decipher. He then pressed a finger to the radio on his shoulder. "Eagle 1, we have the girl. I repeat, we have Grace Peterson." The radio crackled a response that Grace couldn't understand. The man nodded. Understood. He looked back down at Grace, and his stern expression had softened into something kinder, more respectful. "Your mother is waiting for you upstairs, Grace. We'll escort you." Escort her? Soldiers escorting her to her own apartment? The fear and confusion swirled inside her, making her feel dizzy. The two men walked on either side of her, not touching her, but creating a formidable, protective wall around her. They walked up the 3 flights of stairs in silence, their heavy combat boots making loud, rhythmic thuds on the worn wooden steps. With every step, Grace's dread grew. When they reached the 3rd floor, she saw that the door to their apartment, 3B, was open, and standing in the hallway were more men, all dressed in the same dark, intimidating combat gear. They were lean, focused, and radiated an aura of controlled power that was unlike anything Grace had ever encountered. They stood perfectly still as she and her escort approached. As she got closer, she saw that they weren't just soldiers. They were something else. Their gear was more advanced, their weapons more specialized. They were the silent, elite warriors you saw in movies, the ones who operated in the shadows. One of the men in the hallway, who seemed to be the leader, stepped forward. He took off his helmet, revealing a calm, serious face with short-cropped hair and intelligent eyes. He looked at the men who had brought her up. "Thank you. You can return to your post." The men nodded and walked back down the stairs without a word. The leader then knelt, bringing himself down to Grace's eye level. His movements were precise and economical. "Hello, Grace. My name is Commander Thompson. It's an honor to meet you." Grace just stared at him, speechless. An honor? Why would a man like this be honored to meet her? She could see her mother standing just inside the apartment doorway. Helen's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter bewilderment. "Is my mama okay?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. "Your mother is fine," Commander Thompson said, his voice calm and reassuring. "No one is in any trouble. We're here to help. May we come in?" It was a polite question, but it felt like an order. Grace looked at her mother, who gave a small, jerky nod. Grace stepped aside, and Commander Thompson stood up, gesturing for his men to remain in the hallway. He alone stepped into the small apartment, his presence seeming to fill the entire space. Helen rushed to Grace, pulling her into a protective embrace. "What is going on?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "They wouldn't tell me anything. They just said they were waiting for Grace." Commander Thompson stood in the center of their small living room, his eyes taking in the worn sofa, the threadbare rug, the eviction notice still sitting on the kitchen table. His gaze was not judgmental, but rather observant, as if he were memorizing every detail of the room. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, turning to face them. "My name is David Thompson, commander of SEAL Team 6. Yesterday evening, your daughter, Grace, performed an act of kindness that has had significant repercussions. SEAL Team 6. The name hung in the air, impossibly famous, impossibly dangerous. They were legends, whispered about on the news. They were the men who were sent on the most secret, most critical missions. And they were here, in this tiny, failing apartment." Helen held Grace tighter. "I don't understand." The old man on the bench. Commander Thompson nodded slowly. "The man you call the old man on the bench is Admiral Thomas Peterson, retired, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most decorated naval officer of his generation." He paused, letting the weight of the name sink in. "And, as I understand it, he is your grandfather, and Grace's great-grandfather." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Helen stared at the commander, her mind refusing to process the information. Her grandfather? The stern, distant man from her childhood? The legendary Admiral Peterson who had cut off all contact with her mother after she married a simple sailor? He was the man on the bench, shivering, hungry, and alone. That's not possible, Helen stammered. He lives in Virginia. In a big house. We haven't heard from him in over 20 years. Not since my mother. She trailed off, the old family wounds still too raw to speak of. He sold the house in Virginia 2 years ago, ma'am. Commander Thompson said gently. He gave the money away. All of it. To various charities for veterans' families. He came here, to Port Madison, 6 months ago. He wanted to be near the ships. He's been living modestly. Modestly, Helen's voice cracked. He was starving. He was freezing to death on a park bench. Why didn't he call us? Why didn't he let anyone know? Pride is a powerful thing, ma'am, the commander said. Especially for a man like the Admiral. He made his choices. He believes a soldier should be self-reliant to the very end. He didn't want to be a burden to anyone. He came here to fade away, I suppose. He told no one. The Navy, the government, we all thought he was still in Virginia. We lost track of him. It's a significant failure on our part. Commander Thompson then looked at Grace, who was listening to this impossible story with wide, uncomprehending eyes. We would never have found him, he said, his voice filled with a genuine, profound respect. He was hiding in plain sight. We searched for him for 2 days after one of his old service buddies raised an alarm. We used satellites, facial recognition, credit card traces, nothing. He was a ghost. Until yesterday evening. After your daughter bought him dinner, he made a phone call. His first in over 6 months. It wasn't to us. It was to the Secretary of the Navy himself. He took a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Helen. This is a transcript of the call. The Admiral insisted you see it. Helen's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. Grace peered around her mother's arm to read the words. Operator, Secretary of the Navy's office. Admiral Peterson, get me Dan. Tell him it's Tom Peterson. Pause. Secretary of the Navy. Tom? My God, is that you? Where are you? We've been looking for you everywhere. Admiral Peterson, never mind that. I need a favor. There's a girl. Her name is Grace Peterson. She lives at 121 Harbor Street, apartment 3B. She's my great-granddaughter. Secretary of the Navy. Tom, what's going on? Are you all right? Admiral Peterson, I'm fine. But the girl and her mother, they're not. They're in trouble. I need you to fix it. Whatever it takes. Send the best. Send your boys. And Dan, tell them they're taking orders from a 10-year-old girl with blonde hair. Because she saved my life tonight. She did what the entire United States Navy couldn't do. She found one of its own. Now get it done. Call ends. Helen read the transcript twice, the words blurring through her tears. She looked from the paper to the stoic, imposing figure of Commander Thompson, and then down at her small, bewildered daughter. Grace, who had spent her last $5 on a cold stranger. Grace, who had inadvertently launched a rescue mission for one of the most powerful military men in the country. The Admiral is safe now, ma'am, Commander Thompson continued, his voice softening the formal edges. He's at the base hospital. He's malnourished, dehydrated, but he's strong. He's refusing all treatment until he speaks with you and Grace. He then gestured toward the eviction notice on the table. And as for this, consider it handled. The United States Navy is assuming all of your family's debts. A new apartment has been secured for you, overlooking the water, fully furnished. It's the least we can do. The Admiral was very clear in his instructions. He looked around the small apartment again. You won't be needing anything from this place. Outside, the low hum that Grace had noticed earlier began to grow louder. It was the sound of engines, many of them. She walked to the window and peered down at the street. What she saw made her gasp. Her street, which was usually empty except for a few parked cars, was now filled with military vehicles. And standing in perfect, silent formation in the middle of the street were what looked like 100 men. They were all dressed in the same elite combat gear as the men in her hallway. They were the rest of SEAL Team 6 and other Special Forces units that had been scrambled to find the missing Admiral. They stood in the cold gray light, a silent, powerful army, their faces turned up toward her window. They weren't looking at the building. They were looking at her. They were waiting for their orders from a 10-year-old girl with 50 cents in her pocket. Helen came to stand beside her, her arm wrapping protectively around Grace's shoulders. She let out a small, choked gasp as she took in the scene. The entire street, their poor, forgotten street, was now the staging ground for an elite military force. My God, she whispered, her voice trembling. All of this for a bowl of stew. Commander Thompson moved to stand on the other side of Grace. He did not look out the window. His attention was focused entirely on the small girl between them. "They're waiting for you, Grace," he said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of the moment. Grace turned her wide, questioning eyes up at him. "Waiting for me for what?" "The Admiral's instructions were clear," he explained patiently. "He said you were in command, that we were to follow your orders. He said you saved his life, and now it was our duty to save yours." "But I'm just a little girl," she whispered, the enormity of the situation finally crashing down on her. Commander Thompson's serious face broke into a rare, small smile. "Sometimes it takes a little girl to see what grown-ups miss," he said. "You saw a man who was cold and hungry. You didn't see his rank, his past, or his pride. You just saw a human being who needed help. That's a kind of clarity we soldiers sometimes lose. The Admiral wants to make sure you never lose it." He looked at Helen. "We have a car waiting to take you to the base hospital. The Admiral is expecting you." Helen was still struggling to comprehend the tectonic shift that had just occurred in her life. An hour ago, her biggest problem was an eviction notice. Now, she was looking at a street full of Navy SEALs, and her long-lost grandfather, a legendary admiral, was waiting for her. She felt Grace tremble beside her. Pulling on a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, she squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Okay," she said, her voice firmer now. "Okay, we'll go." She looked around the small apartment, at the worn-out furniture that had witnessed all their struggles, all their quiet tears. It was the only home Grace had ever known. Should I pack a bag?" Commander Thompson shook his head. "No, ma'am. Everything you need will be provided. The Admiral was very specific. You are to leave this place and never look back." His words were not unkind, but they were absolute. This was not just a change of address. It was the end of a life. The end of poverty, of struggle, of constant worry. He led them to the door. The SEALs in the hallway snapped to attention as they passed, their movements sharp and synchronized. Grace walked between her mother and the commander, feeling like she was in a parade she hadn't signed up for. The journey down the 3 flights of stairs felt different this time. The building itself seemed to know something had changed. The damp, cabbage-smelling air seemed thinner, the shadows in the corners less menacing. When they stepped out of the building into the cold gray light, a ripple of movement went through the assembled soldiers on the street. It wasn't a sound, but a collective shift, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. A long, black sedan, the kind Grace had only seen in movies carrying important people, was parked at the curb, its engine purring softly. A young sailor in a crisp dress uniform held the back door open. Commander Thompson paused before they reached the car. He turned to Grace. "They're waiting for an order, Grace," he said quietly. "They won't move until you give them one. You just have to tell them what to do." Grace stared at the sea of expectant faces. 100 pairs of eyes, belonging to the most dangerous men on the planet, were all focused on her. Her mind went blank with panic. What could she possibly say? What order could a 10-year-old girl give to a team of Navy SEALs? She looked to her mother for help, but Helen looked just as lost as she did. Then, Grace thought of the old man on the bench. Her great-grandfather. She thought of his cold hands, his shivering body. And the words came to her, simple and clear. She took a deep breath and, in a voice that was small but carried in the profound silence of the street, she said, "You should all go get something warm to eat." A low chuckle rippled through the ranks. Commander Thompson's small smile returned, wider this time. He nodded, a look of deep approval in his eyes. He pressed his radio. "You heard the commander," he said into the mouthpiece, his voice formal but with a hint of warmth. "Mission is to secure a warm meal." Dismissed. The change was instantaneous. The rigid formation dissolved. The men, who moments before had been statues of military discipline, broke into smaller groups, talking and laughing quietly. They began to move off, some heading toward the diner on the corner, others piling into their vehicles. The tension on the street evaporated, replaced by a sense of calm efficiency. They were still soldiers, but for a moment, Grace had made them just men again. Men who were going to get a warm meal on a cold day. Grace and Helen got into the back of the black car. The seats were soft leather, and the inside smelled clean and new. Commander Thompson sat in the front passenger seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, Grace looked out the back window. She saw her building, number 121, for the last time. She saw the peeling paint, the cracked sidewalk, the window to her small bedroom. A place of hardship, yes, but also a place of love, the only home she had ever known. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a quiet goodbye to the little girl she had been only yesterday. The drive to the naval base was short. The car passed through a massive gate guarded by more armed sailors, who snapped a sharp salute as they drove by. The base was a city unto itself, a sprawling complex of gray buildings, vast parking lots, and enormous ships docked at the piers. Everything was clean, orderly, and immense. It was the world her great-grandfather had built, the world he had commanded. The car pulled up in front of a long, low building with a red cross painted on the side. The hospital. Commander Thompson led them through a set of automatic doors into a brightly lit, sterile-smelling lobby. There was no waiting. A naval doctor in a white coat met them immediately, his face serious but kind. "Commander, Mrs. Peterson, young miss," he said, nodding to each of them. "The Admiral is waiting. He's in the VIP wing. Right this way." They followed him down a series of quiet, polished hallways. It was nothing like the chaotic hospitals Grace had seen on television. Here, everything was hushed and calm. They stopped in front of a door with a small, brass plaque that read Admiral T. Peterson. A Marine in a full-dress uniform stood guard outside the door. He nodded to the doctor and opened the door for them. The room was large and filled with sunlight from a wide window that overlooked the bay. In the center of the room, sitting up in a hospital bed, was the old man from the bench. He was different now. He was wearing clean, navy blue pajamas. The hollowed-out look on his face was gone, replaced by a healthy color. He had a blanket tucked around his waist, but his back was still ramrod straight against the pillows. His pale blue eyes, no longer clouded with hunger and cold, were sharp and intelligent. They locked onto Grace the moment she stepped into the room. An array of medical equipment stood silent vigil by his bed, but he ignored it completely. His entire being was focused on the small blonde girl and the woman standing beside her. "Helen," he said, his voice no longer a gravelly rasp but a clear, commanding baritone. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed. Helen seemed to shrink under his gaze. The weight of 20 years of silence, of hurt and misunderstanding, pressed down on her. "Grandfather," she said, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. The Admiral's gaze softened. "I am sorry, my dear," he said, and the simple words were heavy with a generation of regret. "For everything. For my pride. For my foolishness. I should have been there for you. For your mother." Helen's composure finally broke. The tears she had been holding back for so long began to flow freely. "Why?" she asked, her voice choked with sobs. "Why did you cut us off? Why did you hide from us? We thought you hated us." "Never," the Admiral said, his own eyes glistening. "I was angry, and I was proud. A foolish combination for an old soldier. Your mother married a good man, a fine sailor. But he wasn't the man I had chosen for her. I couldn't see past my own plans, my own ambitions for our family. When I lost her, I lost my way. I thought punishing myself, fading away, was the honorable thing to do. I was wrong." His gaze shifted back to Grace, who had been standing silently by her mother's side, taking in this reunion of strangers who were her family. "But then this little soldier found me," he said, a genuine, powerful smile lighting up his face. "She completed a mission that my entire Navy could not. She broke through my defenses. She reminded me what a Peterson is truly made of." He held out a hand, his long, thin fingers beckoning her forward. "Come here, Grace." Hesitantly, Grace walked to his bedside. He took her small hand in his grip surprisingly strong. "You gave me your last $5, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave a stranger your treasure. Do you have any idea how rare that is in this world?" Grace shook her head, her eyes fixed on his. "It is the rarest thing of all," he said. "It is honor. It is compassion. It is the heart of a true leader." He looked over at Commander Thompson, who had been standing quietly by the door. "Commander, my new orders." "Sir." Thompson stepped forward. "My great-granddaughter, Grace Peterson, is hereby awarded the Navy Distinguished Public Service Award for her actions," the Admiral declared, his voice ringing with its old authority. "And furthermore," he continued, his eyes twinkling, "she is appointed as my new personal aide-de-camp." Her first duty is to make sure this old fool eats 3 meals a day and doesn't sit on any more cold benches. Are those orders clear? Commander Thompson snapped a crisp salute. Crystal clear, Admiral. The Admiral then looked back at Grace, his expression becoming gentle once more. What do you say, soldier? Are you up for the job? Grace looked at the powerful old man in the bed, her great-grandfather. She looked at her mother, whose tears were now tears of relief, of a burden lifted. She looked at the stoic Navy SEAL commander, and for the first time in her life, she felt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was not a poor maid's daughter anymore. She was Grace Peterson, and she had a job to do. She stood up a little straighter, just like he did, and gave him a small, determined nod. Yes, sir, she said. The Admiral laughed, a deep, booming sound of pure joy that filled the room and seemed to chase away the last of the shadows. He was home. They were all home. And it had all started with a single, worn-out $5 bill, and the simple, profound kindness of a little girl who saw a hero in the guise of a hungry old man. 6 months later, the biting sea wind felt different. It no longer carried the scent of hardship and worry, but the crisp, clean promise of a new day. From the balcony of their spacious apartment, Grace watched the sun rise over Port Madison, turning the calm waters of the bay to liquid gold. The naval ships in the distance no longer seemed like distant, intimidating giants, but familiar neighbors, silent guardians of her new life. Their new home was a world away from apartment 3B. It was bright, airy, and filled with comfortable furniture that didn't creak and groan with age. The pantry was always full, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee, not just hot water, now greeted Grace every morning. Helen was a different woman. The deep lines of exhaustion on her face had softened, replaced by a calm serenity. She no longer wore a maid's uniform. Instead, she was studying online, pursuing the nursing degree she had abandoned years ago. The laughter that Grace had so rarely heard now echoed through their home, a constant, beautiful music. 3 times a week, a black sedan would arrive to take Grace to her post. Admiral Thomas Peterson now lived in a comfortable house on the base, a place filled with books, naval memorabilia, and the scent of lemon polish. He had regained his strength, and though he walked with a cane, his back was as straight as ever. His official aide-de-camp, a young and perpetually serious lieutenant, handled the official business. Grace's duties were far more critical. She was the Admiral's official storyteller, reading him chapters from her favorite books. She was his head of intelligence, delivering detailed reports on schoolyard politics and the best flavors of ice cream at the local parlor. Most importantly, she was his personal anchor to the world he had almost left behind. Their bond, forged in an act of desperate kindness, had become the cornerstone of both their lives. Aide-de-camp reporting for duty, Admiral, Grace would say, giving him a salute that was becoming crisper by the day. At ease, soldier, he would boom, his blue eyes twinkling. Now, give me your report. What's the word from the front lines? He was teaching her to play chess, explaining the strategy behind each move with the same clarity he had once used to brief presidents. In turn, she was teaching him how to see the world not as a battlefield, but as a place of small wonders, the intricate pattern of a seashell, the joy of a perfectly skipped stone. Helen would often join them for dinner, and the 3 of them would sit around the large oak table, a family reforged in the unlikeliest of fires. The 20 years of silence and pain between Helen and her grandfather had not vanished, but they were healing. They spoke of the past, not with anger, but with a quiet, sad understanding. They were rebuilding their history, one shared memory, one forgiven hurt at a time. One warm Saturday afternoon, the 3 of them, Grace, Helen, and the Admiral, were sitting on the balcony. A gentle breeze rustled the pages of the book in Grace's lap. Down below, a young sailor was struggling to load groceries into his car, a paper bag tearing and sending a cascade of oranges rolling across the pavement. Before Helen or the Admiral could even move, Grace had set down her book. "I'll be right back," she said, and she was out the door and down the stairs in a flash. The Admiral watched from the balcony as his great-granddaughter ran to the sailor's aid. She didn't hesitate. She simply knelt and began gathering the rolling fruit, her small hands working quickly. The young man, flustered and embarrassed, thanked her profusely. Grace just smiled, helped him pack the last of his groceries, and gave a small wave before running back upstairs. She returned to the balcony, her cheeks flushed from the sun. He was going to be late to pick up his wife, she explained simply, picking up her book again. The Admiral looked at Helen, and his pale blue eyes were bright with a pride so fierce it was almost painful. He reached over and gently took Grace's hand, the one that had once held a $5 bill like a sacred treasure. Your mother was worried that this world might make your kind heart hard, he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. But she had nothing to fear. He looked out at the vast, sunlit bay, at the flag flying proudly over the shipyard. True strength isn't about the orders you give, Grace. It's about the kindness you give when no one is watching. It's the most powerful force on earth. You taught this old soldier that. Grace smiled, a pure, uncomplicated smile that held all the promise of their new future. She leaned her head against her great-grandfather's shoulder, a book in one hand, his hand in the other. The light was on. The coffee was hot. And for this family, the road would always be open, leading them home. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.